All right, we're here today on the Gravity Podcast with Liz Brown. Liz, it's great to have you here. It's fun to kind of maybe transition our typical engagement on our group text to this kind of a format, but it's great to see you and great to have you here on the podcast.
Great to see you too, Brett, virtually, of course, but it's really good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, good. So, we were just talking a little bit before we got started as to why you and kind of, what is it about your story that, we should share with the listeners. And I'm just impressed with what you're doing. And we've known each other a long time now. I've watched kind of not just you but other members of city council really lead with so much passion around current issues, things that, I think really need to be talked about, brought to the forefront. It's been fun for me to have, what I'll consider to be friends and contemporaries really leading. I'm curious to kind of hear, how did you get to that point, right? What's the journey to that? Because it's really, I think, inspiring to watch. I know you might not kind of own that as much as I want you to, but it really is to watch really young, passionate people in positions of power, making a difference in the community.
Well, thank you for saying that. It means a lot coming from you. I think that it's interesting when you think about government service. It takes it takes a boldness and sort of willingness to put yourself out there in order to campaign and win a position in government. Campaigning, for anyone who's ever been a part of a campaign, if you volunteered to knock on doors or worked with a candidate up close, you understand how much hard work goes into it. And you have to be really open to talking to people and hearing from people and listening, and then selling yourself, right? I mean, it's inherently self-promotional. All of that can be a little awkward, but you get through it because there's, the end goal to actually serve. And then I found, once I got through that campaign process and I was actually on city council, it actually takes a little while to, even after you've done something really hard and won, to fully sit with your confidence that you can do the job, that your voice is as important as, more experienced people around you. Because I'll just speak for City Hall. That's the only place I've ever served. When I was new to it, I was the newbie, right? There were veteran council members who were already there, and a lot of civil servants in City Hall and in the city that really had a record I admire, right? They put in tons of years of service. And here I was saying, well, wait, I want to do it differently. Am I allowed to ask to do something differently, right? Like, who am I to sort of get in there and try to push a different direction? So I do think it takes a little bit to get your sea legs. And then I have, in the last few years, I have a lot more confidence in sort of demonstrating leadership. And I don't mean to overblow my own leadership. I really mean this kind of broadly about elected officials in general, that there is a process to kind of owning that leadership and new direction that you may want to take things.
Yeah. And I want to go back to the beginning as to how you arrived where you are, and we'll do that. But as long as we're talking about it, I was actually having this conversation this morning. I just got back from Austin, Texas, where my son is in school, and somebody asked me if Matthew McConaughey was really seriously making a run at governor. And my son had said that like the early polling suggests he's like way ahead. So it's an interesting thing, right? So the conversation that we had this morning was, well, what's to say that somebody who doesn't have the typical political resume, right? So maybe that's background in moving up through political positions, or maybe in the past you needed to go to law school or some sort of, right, like traditional path into politics. What's to say that somebody coming at it from a different experience, from a different angle, can't be maybe even more effective, right? And in some ways, I think of you and Shannon and other young members of council as people that are coming at it from a different perspective, right? Because of your youth, and maybe I mean, I think you've both grown up in your case, the two of you in particular, around politics, right? And maybe, in what would appear to be a more traditional sense, but you arrived at a position of power at a pretty young age. And I've always been attracted to just the kind of perspective that you're coming at because of your youth, because of your, experience. I don't know, maybe there's, I don't know if there's something to that or not from your perspective.
I think there is. And I will give you an example from a colleague, not on city council, but someone else similarly situated to me in terms of time in our lives. So I won my race for city council right after I'd had my first child. And then, so that means my entire 6 years on Columbus City Council, with the exception of a few months, I've been either pregnant or breastfeeding, right? Like I've been in these early motherhood stages with two of my three children, with all three children, basically. And I do think that for a long time, especially women were not looked at as being ready for office until they had reared children. Men were sort of given a pass that you can have a young family and be elected. But women, it was a little bit harder to feel, not necessarily from the voters, but also sometimes just from the quote powers that be. And, because of that, a colleague of mine who's, again, similarly situated, different branch of government, but she told me that she was having some conversations with some older male colleagues of hers who had no concept for the idea of the cost of childcare. That they really were thinking about a family's budget, and they said something like the car payment being the second most expensive thing a family faces after a mortgage or rent, which is just completely wrong. I mean, completely wrong. I don't think that's right on a lot of levels, but certainly the only time it could be is if whoever is caring for your child doesn't work, and that's free, right? And so just having my experience with being a mother of young children, first and foremost, is, I think, part of representative democracy. Representative democracy isn't just about the demographics that you hold, although getting more women, and especially more women of color and people of color, into office is important. It's also about life experience. Representative democracy has to be about generation, life experience, all these things that go into you being able to say, I get it, with more and more people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I'm a huge fan of bringing your life experience to your work, no matter what you do, right? I mean, that's been kind of the thing for me that has worked the best, is whenever I see a problem in my own life, or whenever I am struggling with something of any magnitude, and a lot of times they're little things, you can bring that into the work as a place to try to solve problems that you're not alone, right? So, that kind of experience you just described, there are many people out there sharing that experience. It can sound, and you don't sound this way, but sometimes I am sensitive to sounding a bit kind of like selfish or self-involved when I say, like, I have problems, I want to solve them. It's just that I know they're a reflection of a broader issue.
Yeah, and you're not the only one.
Right, you're not the only one. So let's talk about your life experience. Let's go back to the beginning. Tell me a little bit about kind of your, early childhood, kind of what that environment was like for you. your family, et cetera?
So I was born in Columbus. I was born in Berwick. My parents divorced when I was young. I was not even 3 yet when they separated. So my older sister, Emily, and we were the 2 children that my parents had before they split. And, because of that, it's interesting. So you never look back and think, oh, that's great that my parents got divorced, right? Like that's just not what your instincts would tell you. However, I am a glass half full kind of person. And, I think about the events that occurred because they divorced. First and foremost, there was a lot of moving around when I was little, Berwick to Near East Side to Hilltop, a little bit of time at Harrison West, kind of a little bit all over. Ultimately, my mom remarried and moved out to Licking County. And then my dad moved back up north where he was born and grew up. He grew up in Mansfield. He moved up to Lorain. So yeah, there was a lot of moving around. Maybe that wasn't awesome. But then I got to have this childhood in kind of 2 places. And I got to know 2 distinct kinds of Ohio. And I actually think that's a blessing. I also gained step siblings and half siblings from that experience. And then the most important thing I think I gained, and again, this is a weird thing to say glass half full about your parents splitting up, but I just got to say, I have never in my whole life, because I don't remember much before I was 3 years old, functioned, had a relationship with my parents as a unit, right? I've never had like a parental unit. I've had a mom and I've had a dad, and I have independent relationships with each of them. Those independent relationships have been the central blessing in my life. They have loved me. They have made me feel secure. They have expanded the way I think. They have challenged me and supported me. And I actually think a core component of my confidence comes from the fact that it was 2 separate relationships. I have friendships with each of my parents. And again, I know it sounds weird, but there is this blessing in, I think, growing who I was because of that, early childhood, quote, instability that's right up there on the ACEs score for something traumatic, right? But I'm so lucky to have these 2 parents that just loved me and supported me at every turn.
Well, I've kind of, this is an interesting one because, I also come from a divorced family. My parents were divorced when I was 10. And I also have landed at a place that is of tremendous gratitude for the experience that I've had in life. Like you, I've gained half siblings. I've gained another father. I've moved. I have just grown. I've been through things that maybe people who don't have that experience haven't had, and I look at it as a blessing. It has been very much a blessing in my life. So it's not that's strange. What I think is kind of unique in doing this podcast, there's a theme that's emerged really, which is people have kind of one of 2 different childhoods. One is some sort of traumatic experience, and the other is usually a unconditionally loving experience. And you're describing what sounds like an unconditionally loving experience, even though, like you said, a divorce for a young child can be traumatic. Mm-hmm. Now, so what I'm curious about is the blessing piece, the gratitude. Is that something that comes now as an adult, or somewhere in your early adulthood? How was the experience as a kid? Were you too young to know any different, or was there some sense of this is hard, this is tough, this is struggling, we're moving around a lot? What was the experience like, when you were young?
That's a great question, and very perceptive, because when I was young, I would have told you, that I hated that they were divorced. I mean, I don't know how many years of my childhood, every time there was a wishing well, I'd throw a penny in and wish my parents would get back together, which is obviously unrealistic. And yet I still wished it every time, kind of knowing it wouldn't happen. As I became an adolescent, I was always frustrated that they lived so far apart. 2.5 hours is not across the country, but to me, it felt far apart. I'd have to make choices between, because I went to school where my mom lived. I went to, elementary through high school where my mom lived. And so I'd have to make choices between like the Friday night football game and getting to spend the weekend at my dad's. And I thought that was so unfair because I obviously wanted to do both. And so as a child, I thought I'd, really drawn a bad lottery ticket in, being in a divorced family. I didn't have a lot of friends who had divorced parents or separated parents. And it really was, I think as an adult or maybe more in college that I recognized what I had gained from it. And ultimately, it's hard to say gain or that sounds a little weird, what I had gained, but I think ultimately it's about what I had never lost. Like, yes, it is too bad that I didn't have, that I had to make those choices between the Friday night football game and my dad's house, or, that I couldn't have, my dad home every day when I came home from X or Y, school thing, or that I missed my mom on the weekends. I went to my dad. Like all of that is true. It's not purely gained, but I didn't lose, right? I did not lose the love, the support, the challenge, the intellectually challenging way that they each interacted with us to spur our imaginations and creativity and ambitions. Mm-hmm. I didn't lose any of that. I just got two versions.
Yeah. And I think, this is really great because I've actually not heard somebody kind of describe it this way. And maybe it's a unique experience that, you did have the separation of the family unit, which does, come with the logistical challenges and the needs that, aren't, ideally met that, you long for as a kid. But yet your parents really did stay very present in doing their independent jobs to the fullest so that you could get the needs that the children have, love primarily. So, and I think if I'm right about this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember seeing your mother involved at campaign events or for your father.
Yeah.
That it appears like the two of them have maintained a very good relationship as well. Is that true?
I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Not when I was a kid.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Please don't. Yeah.
Yeah. No. It's like their ultimate argument was about time with us, right? So like my dad always wanted more of it. My mom always wanted more of it. Like that's what they argued about. And there were arguments when I was a kid, and I remember that.
Yeah.
But it was never like, the arguments weren't about like, no, you got to take the kids. I'm too busy. Right. It was the opposite. So in some ways, like this love was at the center of even some strife. And then in adulthood, my mom has been very involved with my dad's campaigns and helpful. And they both are involved in my own campaigns. And that actually brings up an interesting point again about childhood experiences because of the divorce. So my dad has been in office since the time I was born. He lost a re-election campaign in 1990. So there were a couple years where he taught at OSU instead of served, but then he got back into office. And because my dad was single. So when we were with him, we went to everything he did. We went to every campaign event. Sometimes we would go to Washington on the big healthcare vote in the 90s, under the Clinton administration. They had votes over the weekend. So my dad, flew us there to be with him because he wasn't going to give up a weekend. So what happened is I actually got a closer look at my dad's public service than maybe I would have gotten if he and my mom had been married and there'd been kind of a divide and conquer strategy with childcare. Mm-hmm. And that is, I can draw a direct line from that to whether it's my ultimate career choice or whether it's the values that undergird that career choice and how I do this career. Mm-hmm. I got to see it up close.
Yeah, very interesting. And again, kind of another reason we do this podcast is to kind of tug on these threads of like, well, look at you, you're, like getting a front row seat to public life of service. I mean, how does that not, get kind of like even more embodied, as you go through your life? Tell me a little bit about kind of the part where you say that I wasn't always happy about my parents separating. And yet, you've got this kind of love coming in at the same time. So what were you like as you start to kind of move into, elementary, high school, middle school? What's Liz like as a result of all those kind of various things going on?
My parents always talk about how I was a happy kid, and I have memories of feeling like a happy kid. I really was never interested in sports. My big sister was, and a lot of my friends were. So I had what really seriously, I have a lot of childhood memories of being like traumatized, to use the word totally lightly, by having to engage in athletics. Like it was just not my preference.
Yeah.
My 5-year-old daughter, her pre-K just sent home a flyer about they're going to have a pre-K field day in a couple weeks. And I was like, oh God, I hated field day. Like I was experiencing it again.
Yeah.
So I gravitated towards, I did do sports and ultimately found the confidence to just say, this isn't for me. Sometime in high school, I just stopped. I stopped track. I stopped volleyball. I said, this isn't for me. It's not helping me grow. It's not, building my confidence. And I focused entirely on kind of dorky stuff. I loved the plays. I did the fall play and the spring play. I was in drama club. It gave me a ton of joy. I was in, church choir, which I don't have a great singing voice, but again, it has that performative element. And I loved that. I helped start a mock trial team in high school. I loved Latin club and French club. So that was really where I think, when I was being true to myself, what I ultimately gravitated towards. And I loved music as well. I played the piano for 13 years of lessons on the piano. And I was really good by the time I graduated high school. I unfortunately didn't regularly maintain the practice. And so I'm a little rusty now, but someday I plan to get back into it.
Yeah, well, you've got your hands full, but it'll come back, I'm sure. So that is interesting, that you were focused on kind of not just the non-sports stuff, but that you're active in all the clubs. I mean, maybe there's some sort of thread to tug on there that is, you feeling active, that you wanted to be kind of, engaged in some, I don't know, work. Is that true? I mean, was there any sense of this kind of experience that you were having, being with your dad and kind of seeing that front row seat to service? Does that start to come in at all, like early, or are you mostly just kind of high school kid doing high school kid things?
Well, I would say it did come into play early through things like when I started to help start the mock trial team. So I did mock trial as a freshman, and then the mock trial team folded, and a friend of mine, because the advisor left, and a friend of mine decided we wanted to start it again. And so that was where I really loved kind of the debate side of mock trial. It's a really great intellectual activity for kids. But I would say that I really just wanted to, when I was doing athletics, like I wasn't useful. I was mostly like sitting the bench, or I wasn't very good, at track. And so I didn't go to all the meets, because I wasn't called up for all the meets kind of thing. And I really wanted to be useful. I wanted to be additive to my community. And that is what I saw. I really felt my dad did a lot for our community, our state, our city. And his existence was really additive to the community. And my mother too, in a totally different line of work. But I do think that probably served as a foundation for some of the things I wanted to be active in.
And what was your mother's line of work?
So my mom is formally trained in social work, and she's always focused on seniors. Now what she does is run a statewide association of area agencies on aging. So they exist to help make sure seniors have access to home care. We know what better health outcomes seniors have if they can receive care in their home rather than sometimes they need an actual live-in facility like a nursing home, but as often as possible. And it's expensive. And so, it's important that organizations like Area Agencies on Aging exist to help make sure low-income seniors can have those same possibilities for dignified care in their homes.
Mm-hmm. And when you're, kind of in the debate world and you're kind of, starting these things, leading these things. I'm just curious, like, are you actually thinking that someday you want to go into politics, or are you just feeling like you need to be of action, of service? I mean, at that point in your life, did you have a sense that you wanted to follow in your dad's footsteps that specifically, or did you just kind of have that combination of caring and wanting to be active from both of your parents?
Yeah, I did not think I wanted to formally go into politics. I loved debating my peers in government class. Like I've always loved politics itself and big ideas about how our society should be structured and what is justice and how do we pursue social justice. And these threads are things that across my entire family, both sides are very important and always subjects at the dinner table, all of that. But myself, I loved doing that and it was very stimulating to me, but I also really loved writing. That wasn't something that I brought up. I loved writing poetry. I loved writing short stories. And ultimately, really, especially in college, started enjoying journalism, like writing for our college magazine. And so I thought that I would write for a living, go work at a magazine or a newspaper. Didn't quite have the ambition to be a novelist because that's so hard, but wasn't crossing it off the table. But ultimately, that's what I thought I would pursue, and then always do politics kind of extracurricularly, I guess is sort of how I thought of it. And it caught me by surprise when I changed my mind, but I did, and I'm really glad I did.
There's also this kind of really creative thread here too that's part of who you are, from whether it be the music or the writing. Talk a little bit about kind of the role that the arts or creativity had in your life, kind of as you have moved through it.
Yeah, well, I think the arts in general are an important thing to, I think, expose kids to and help them tap into their creative outlet, because the arts help us, the way I think of it, the arts help us see how big the world can be. Like it expands our horizons to think about ideas, concepts, places that we can't imagine within our own experience. The arts, more than anything else, can be really, I guess, transformative in how we look at the world and conceive of what the world might be. Which is why when I think about writers who have said the most about humanity and our possibilities, I usually think of creative writers. I think of people like Toni Morrison and James Baldwin and Langston Hughes. And we quote poetry to really demonstrate this higher level, I think, that humans can work to achieve. So for me, that's part of what, the creativity of writing brought me, something I think about a lot with my kids too, and wanting to tap into their creativity or nurture it. And I forget actually exactly what the question was that you asked, so I'm not sure if I answered.
Well, no, yeah, you're answering. I was just curious about kind of the role creativity, had played in your life. So tell me a little about, this kind of time in college where you're studying journalism. What's kind of your mindset at that point, and as you start to think about kind of going into career, what happens?
Between high school and college, I took a gap year and I was an AmeriCorps member with City Year. My older sister, there's a theme here. I just moved in next door to my older sister. And between high school and college, I chose the city I was going to do AmeriCorps in based on where she was in college. So I've just been following her around my whole life. But I went to Philadelphia to do City Year. And that's an AmeriCorps program in the schools. So I was in a middle school in Northeast Philly and worked with all kinds of kids. I was an assistant teacher essentially in 3 different classrooms and had some incredible experiences with kids and really saw up close and personal this intersection between public policy and people's lives. Was still very dedicated to writing as a career, some kind of journalism. But I have to say that was when the seed was planted that maybe journalism wasn't going to happen for me because public policy was such an interest. And when I say intersection, I don't just mean what kind of education policy was written in Harrisburg, for the state of Pennsylvania, like textbooks and class sizes and things like that, building maintenance. I also mean housing policy, right? I mean, some of the kids I got very close to told me very real stories about why it was hard to learn that day. I mean, I would pull kids out if they were having behavior problems and walk them around the building. And I understood that, having a very loving grandma, but having to separate from your mom for a couple nights because of what was happening at home, either with her job or, with the rent payment or the neighborhood where they lived, and spend a couple nights at grandma's. That's still hard for a kid. It's uprooting, and it makes it hard for them to learn the next day. Wage policies, housing policies, all of these things, I really think were planted in that year. And the last thing I'll touch on about it is it also taught me how I should feel when I went to bed at night and when I got up in the morning about what I was choosing to dedicate my time to. Like AmeriCorps taught me what it really feels like to be driven by passion. And then ultimately when I went into, I got a job in journalism after college and didn't have that feeling. It was super fun and I loved it, but it didn't have that passionate feeling that City Year drove in me. And so that year between high school and college was really formative for both of those reasons.
Yeah, it is. It's so interesting because, we talked a little bit about kind of, passion and really using your life experience to inform your work. And, I couldn't agree more that it should be passion, that, you should be able to love your work. That is how we spend a lot of our time, right? And so why would we not? And I had a similar experience where I actually had the opposite experience where I saw people who did not have that passion. That was kind of my first entree into the working world. And it made such an impact on me that, I just couldn't tolerate that that's how people were living and going to spend most of their time. So that the fact that you had that experience before you started working and then you went to work and realized it wasn't there is unique. So what happens then when you realize like there's not the passion here that I know exists and you're working in journalism? What do you do?
Well, it was 2008 when I realized the job I had. I was at a magazine that I loved again and that I still read, but it just wasn't what I wanted it to be for me. It was 2008. I was living in New York City, working at this magazine, and my home state was like ablaze with excitement over the Obama campaign and all these really cool local races. Democrats were trying to take back control of the Ohio House. So I called, not my dad, but someone else I knew in politics back here in Ohio to get like unbiased advice. My dad tends to be like, you can do anything. And so I needed somebody who wasn't my dad, giving me advice. And he said to me, you should, you would, despite the fact you think you don't have experience, bring a lot to the table in a couple different roles, basically, and just told me to go for it and apply for them because that was the time that campaigns were staffing up. So, I did. I took a chance, and I actually thought I would maybe do that for a little bit and then come back to New York. And what I found is that same feeling of passion, going to bed with it, waking up with it, that I had found in City Year, because I felt my presence and my dedication was making a difference. It is an amazing thing to feel that like you've matched your purpose, that, your effort is actually helpful to others and doing something and productive. And that's what I felt. And so I knew, okay, I'm going to stay in Ohio. I'm going to keep doing this because it feels exactly right.
And so tell me, what was that? What was that kind of first entree in?
So I was a campaign manager for a state rep race in kind of the eastern portion of Franklin County. And I was really doubtful that I could take on a campaign manager. I had never worked professionally in politics. And that was where this contact with a key friend and mentor back in Ohio was so important, because he demystified the role for me and said, you know what, I know that this would be your first paid job in politics, but here's what being a campaign manager for a state rep really looks like. And importantly, here's the support you would have. So there are all kinds of folks that you can call to help support you in a role like that. And once that was demystified for me, I did have the confidence to do it. And what it felt like, which I think was different from how I felt when I was working at this magazine, what it felt like, the experience is I was anticipating challenges and solving them. I was able to respond using my instincts and be mostly right about it. I was able to motivate people, to bring them to the table, to help. Like all these things. I mean, I'm talking about a political campaign, but I think that goes for any line of work that a person is looking in. When you can do those kinds of things, it really resonates with who you are. And I think it channels your own passion for your work. And again, not unique to political campaigns, but that is where I found my ability to do those things.
Yeah, it's sometimes I get asked the question about how do you get into real estate development? And, one of the things that I've kind of started to realize is that the way into anything is just doing it. Mm-hmm. And it's never and there's certainly exceptions, that you've got to be, really trained for and studied. Yeah. But, it's never what I think we think it is in our minds, right? We have this kind of feeling about a title like campaign manager. Oh, well, how are you well, you must have done that, before. Well, what happens, to the person who had never done it before and then ends up being the person that has? You start somewhere and you just do it. And I think there's maybe a undervaluing of our intuitive skills. And maybe this goes back to the beginning conversation we had around who makes sense to be an effective politician today. The more that we can actually rely on our life experience, our intuitive skills, our thinking, right? The people we surround ourselves with, the more effective you really can be, maybe more so than you think before you get into something like that you've not done before.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. That really resonates. And then you find that kind of match with who you are and how your instincts develop and what kind of problems you love solving, right? Because I love to solve problems, but that doesn't mean I'd be very good at solving problems in real estate development like you do, right? Like I love the challenges that I have to work through in this public policy space. That doesn't mean I'm good at it everywhere, but like once you find and you try those things and develop your skills, you grow and you know how to do better, be better, raise yourself up in that profession. So it's not simply like, oh, jump in and be a CEO. There's some work that has to, you have to hone, but when it feels right, I think you know it.
Yeah. And I think that passion is really a big piece of it because, as you say, I wouldn't be a good real estate developer. I think that you probably would be actually if you wanted to be, if you really, right. And that want is about the passion.
That's right.
You're smart enough, you're capable enough. I know this business, sure, it's hard, but, I learned it. You could too. It's just that you have no interest in it,
Right.
right?
It's the passion. That's exactly
Right.
it. Yeah.
So tell me then, what's the path from that campaign manager job to city council?
Yeah. So that campaign job, as often happens, led to an opportunity on the official side to actually work in the State House in policy. And I started working. My job was in communications because I knew how to write, and writing is a really valuable skill. Anyone out there who's listening to this who's young and like figuring out what skills they should hone, like learn how to write. Everyone can use your skills if you know how to write. So anyway, I was hired because I could write well. And so I worked in the communications office. And what that meant is I was translating policy to things people could understand, pitching it to reporters, writing newsletters and releases on it for constituents and residents. And that was a great way to learn about all the policy being developed because I wasn't specializing. I was, kind of had to be a generalist. And I ended up I also met my husband there, so that was a good move. But that job really led to me working on the official side and then back on the campaign side and then back on the official side again. And I did that throughout my 20s, really, before ultimately working for the city of Columbus on the official side. And really, that's where I realized that running for local office was something I very much wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I seeing it is what made me want to do it.
Yeah, and before we kind of talk about you as a city councilwoman and in kind of today's times where things stand and kind of how you're leading, I am curious just kind of on the personal side, as you talk about writing, I'm wondering, do you write for yourself? You mentioned your piano skills are a little rusty. What do you do? What should people know about how you take care of yourself when you're so focused on taking care of your children? You have young kids, your family, and serving this community. Where do you fit in? How do you take care of yourself, or what do you do that kind of charges your batteries?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I don't do enough for myself. I mean, honestly, when I have a free moment, I think this is very typical of young parenthood, early parenthood. I don't really think of myself as that young, but early parenthood. When I have a free moment, I think about, okay, I see this giant mess on my dining room table right now. Like, I got to pick that up, right? I mean, it's just, it's hard to suppress those instincts to spend your free time on productivity. But one thing I've really tried to do, I'm really rusty as a creative writer. I still write, non-creatively, more on subject matter, but I'm very rusty. Every once in a while, I'll be like nursing my baby and moved to like write a poem about how beautiful her face is. And I'll write something, I'll reread it the next day and be like, that's terrible. So that's just kind of here and there, little things I try to do. But what I'm becoming more disciplined about, because I've noticed how much it helps me, is reading before I turn the lights out at night. I always have a novel by my bed, and it is good for my soul. I don't get through books as fast as I'd like to, or as fast as I once did. But I will turn the lamp on, read. Sometimes it's 10 minutes before my eyelids are too heavy, and then I'll put it down. Sometimes it's an hour and 10 minutes, but I do that really every night.
Yeah, and I think your answer is that's a great thing to modality to utilize for a lot of reasons, but the first part of the answer, which you said I could do better, or I could do more, or I'm not doing a lot right now, I think is also really important for people to hear, because that's real, and I think it's okay.
Yeah.
My wife has really been very clear about her focus on the kids, while we've been raising our kids, while they're under our roof, and that a lot of things took a back seat to that, and I personally put a lot of things, in the back seat when it was growing my business. And sometimes, you're at a stage in life where certain things have to take a back seat.
Yep.
And, you got to be careful not to stay there too long because it's just not sustainable. But, let's be honest, when you have young kids and you're working and, life is a bit full just from that, you might not be able to play piano as much as you'd like to. And I think it's really important for people to know that and hear that too is normal and can be more than okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I agree. Because if we beat ourselves up for it on either end, too much self-care, not enough self-care, I mean, it's counterproductive. Just do what you can and check in with yourself on your mental health. Like that's really the important piece. If you prioritize what your kids need for years over what you need, but that's what feels right, then when you check in with yourself on your mental health, it's going to feel somewhat whole. Sure, a little imbalanced at times, but at least whole. But if you're feeling depleted, like half a person, all of those things, then like something does got to give and prioritize it.
Yeah. Now this last year, plus now, I guess, it has been a very unique time on a lot of levels. And you've been in the middle of needing to lead this city as a result. We've seen, kind of protests, and we've seen, serious issues on the from the police force. We've seen, racial tension. We've seen people out of work, right? This pandemic. I mean, it's been pretty nonstop. And I've talked to some of your colleagues, and I know how hard you guys have been working. Tell me a little bit about the past year and really, kind of where you sit today as as an important leader in this city. Tell me a little bit about kind of what you've been through and kind of how you're feeling today.
Well, the last year has been part of the reason it's been so challenging is that the obstacles, the challenges weren't contained to just the professional front or just the personal front, right? And I am not saying anything unique. I think a lot of people feel that that we were really pressed on the professional side to achieve, and then also had the kind of constraints we'd never really faced on the personal side. I would say what's a little different about being on city council during all of this is just the public facing elements of the profession, that, what I say or what I fail to say is scrutinized almost always. What I do or what I fail to do lets people down or doesn't, right? There is this sense of pressure that my choices and my actions can either help people or fail to help them. And that is a responsibility that can weigh very heavily. There's so much to say on this topic. To get like super personal for a second, if that's not weird.
No, not at all.
Okay, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about when I went into labor with my daughter in December.
Mm-hmm.
So I was pregnant for most of the pandemic, and I was, since I'm over 35, I had to get induced I chose to get induced the day after her due date. So we went into the hospital to for our appointment for my induction, and we were talking about how important writing and creativity is to me. So I brought the novel I was reading at the time. It was my bedside novel. I thought, I'm going to read during labor, and it'll help me get through it. So my husband and I, like in between contractions, I read, and then I would have the contraction, and honestly, it helped me get to the other side that I knew I was going to get to resume my book. I had not done this in other labors, but it was very calming, and I was grateful that we made that decision to do that. Then just a few hours into labor, I got a text from someone at City Hall informing me that Andre Hill had been shot and killed by Columbus police, and that the story was unfolding and we didn't know a lot yet. And we were looking at body camera footage. And that was escalating as my labor progressed. And there came a time I was sad. I was confused. I was angry, like a lot of us. I was attentive. I wanted to know what was happening. I asked for support from my legislative aide to help funnel information so that I could get only what was most important and still progress in my labor. And then I got to a point where I couldn't anymore. Like I couldn't pay attention to what was happening anymore for this man, this father, this grandfather whose life had been taken for no goddamn reason by someone employed by me, by you, by residents of this city to actually protect him. But I couldn't be there anymore. I was 7 centimeters. I needed to hunker down. The novel wasn't cutting it anymore. I couldn't focus on this. And then I had my baby and it was incredible. And the rest of the time in the hospital and for the first couple weeks of her life, it was a radical practice in how we balance our personal passions and obligations and love with these professional passions I have and that feeling of wanting to do and be there for the community. And I don't think that I did it particularly well, but I did everything I could. And I was emotionally a wreck. And kind of feel like I need to still make up for what I didn't do during that time because I couldn't, because I was meeting my daughter, learning to breastfeed with her, staying up all hours of the night, making sure she's safe. And that's just a little window of a couple weeks of the last year, but it was a real test for me and one that I don't think I particularly passed or failed, but certainly struggle with still.
Yeah, interesting. I was just kind of thinking about that first text that comes in and that, you answered it to begin with, that that's the kind of job that you have, that there's certain things, especially right now, that can't really be unanswered, even, during a time, like childbirth.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that you were able to kind of make room for that through that process up to a certain point speaks, I think, volumes about how committed you are. Because I'm not sure that you actually had to do that. Maybe I don't know the job well enough, but
right.
It's probably more about your passion for the people and for justice and for your work
Mm-hmm.
that, has you feeling like you need to stay engaged. I see people who take paternity leave and, turn their auto signature on and literally don't respond to, email or messages, and we're not talking about the same thing here,
Mm-hmm.
So I think it just says how committed you are. Is that kind of, and maybe you're not going to be as quick to say this about yourself, but I'll say it and then you can just say yes or no. But, I think it shows how kind of like embodied this work is for you, that there isn't a separation really between work and life. And sure, there is to some degree. I guess in your case, like it starts at, at I don't know, 7 centimeters, I guess, or something, right? Like that's where that's your line, but is that true? Is that just kind of how you view what you do and as just kind of who you are and it's really just one?
Yeah, I do think it's really fluid with the rest of life. And I also think that a failure to create any boundaries would ultimately kind of doom my longevity in this work, because while I'm passionate about it, everyone has human limitations. And so I do need to ensure I have some boundaries and create them, and partly for my kids too, because there's so much work that happens on your phone, right? And when you're a public official, you're being like added all the time. And if I didn't park that, I would never be able to fully be there for my kids, which is just the most important thing. And so I do think that you live the work when you're passionate about your career, and especially when it's like public facing, public oriented, you live the work. But I always do remind myself that boundaries have to come into play.
So tell me, as we start to wrap up, what's the future look like? What's the future for you? Mm-hmm. And what's the future for Columbus?
Mm-hmm. Well, I will tell you, I've learned a great deal over this last year, as I think probably everyone you talk to would say. And part of what I've learned is really, this sounds so stupid, but like I've learned a lot more about how to use my voice. I really don't mean for that to sound cliched, but the stakes have been so high this last year. And on several key police reform related issues, I've been kind of a minority voice, but I've been super, super loud. And I think that I changed the conversation or moved it in a direction that's actually where a majority of Columbus wants to see, or at least where justice is on our side. Like, let's get real that when the Voting Rights Act passed mid 20th century, if you'd actually had everyone in America vote on it, it very well might not have passed. That was the judgment of elected officials who sometimes have to see which side justice is on and do it. And it's not just about, putting your finger up and seeing which way the wind is going. It's bold and it's judgment. So I've learned a lot about that, and I hope to have added something to the conversation. I've learned a lot about being annoying is okay sometimes if it's going to move things down the line. I had an initiative that I'm really proud of. My focus coming out of the pandemic is how are we helping real people? Like how are we getting resources to real people, real families in our city? And one of the things we worked on was an emergency financial assistance program with Columbus Urban League. And I championed that. I formulated it. My office got it done. And it has helped nearly 1,000 families when they need it the most, and help them avoid financial ruin simply for having a COVID diagnosis. That wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been really annoying to a lot of people about the need to get it done. So I've learned those things in terms of what's next. I think I have a better ability to check into my own gut instincts on stuff. As we build back from this pandemic, we have to confront a newer, better normal. And I think that's what has to be next for Columbus. We talked a lot before the pandemic about how while our prosperity is growing as a city, so is our poverty rate, and how that was untenable. But I think now, like, we know better and we have to do better. After the 2010 recession, things started getting better, except for about a third of families. We cannot let that happen again coming out of this downturn. We owe it to everyone to be on the side of those who need us the most, and to push that direction. And for me personally, again, I just hope, just like I, wanted to be at mock trial, like I just hope to be additive, right? I hope to be, championing the right things and winning the debate on it.
Yeah. Well, there's no question you're additive. So, I think you can probably always throw the bar out there and kind of see what needs to be done. And that's part of your job, and you don't even have to look. People are telling you, all the time. You're seeing it, firsthand, that there's so much work to be done. And, a lot of work has been done. You guys have done a lot. Yeah. I mean, unbelievable amount. I think that story of you in childbirth, really says just how much you guys have been doing. That not a minute was taken off, even when it really very easily was justified. to say the least. So a lot has been done. And so for that, I thank you. And I think you guys are doing a great job. I love, I think I said this at the beginning, but I love seeing the passion, that activism, that, there are issues that, we live in a city and, I can't really speak for our state, but we do live in a city where people care about transformative change, and that there's a aspiration for things to be done in the way that I'll say is right. Now that's debatable, and I know, and my views on right might be a little bit more aligned with yours, and some other people might be listening and saying, we're making huge mistakes. But personally, I think some of these things are pretty clear, and that people collectively need to be thriving, and many are not, and that there's certain injustice that has to be fixed, and that you and your colleagues are really focused on fixing that. And I think we're really fortunate as a city to have that kind of mindset and that kind of leadership. So thank you. And thank you for taking time to do this. And I'll let you have any final thoughts that you want to share with our audience.
Well, I thank you for the conversation. It was really fun. I don't get to talk this way and reflect all that often because it's do all the time. I can't talk about, parenthood and motherhood without also just plugging the idea that I think that's where our society is begging for the most reform right now. And in part because when there aren't enough family supports, we are really sabotaging our future. And those who bear the brunt of it are women, and particularly Black and Brown women. And so if we want to drive our city forward through an equity lens and really make a difference and build that city that my daughters and my son are going to grow up in, we have to look at putting families' needs first and having the backs of women. How are the women doing is the best question you can ask to understand how a city or a community is doing. And I understand that intimately as a mother, but I understand that it's power sort of across society. We've never really tapped into what it means to support mothers and think about what we could be and what we could do if we really do that.
Wonderful. Well, let's end there, because I don't think that there's anything more important. I agree with you. It does start in childhood, and that is why we start our podcast there too, because I like to kind of highlight what's happening in these early stages of our life that do really play an impact in us. And, I think you've kind of started with sharing, the unique childhood that you had. And the commonality between those two themes that I mentioned, between the trauma and the unconditional love, is that the guests that we have on all kind of land at a place of seeing how either path served them perfectly well. Mm-hmm. So I say that because if you're somebody who doesn't have the childhood experience or the parental care and love, you too still can end up, at a place of success and a place where you're able to thrive in life. But it's a hell of a lot harder. It's a hell of a lot harder. And so this is the problem that, I agree with you, does need to be elevated and solved, hopefully.
Awesome.
So, Liz, thank you. It's great to see you. Great to have you here. And thanks again.
Thank